what if you build IE or LDR as your second item? That was the #1 question I got on my last video. Y'all wanted me to compare it as a second item, not a third item, because there's a fair number of ADCs that are doing that these days. So let's go and do that, right? We can do that. We have my main Excel spreadsheet open here, or Google Sheets, whatever. So you can see a little behind the scenes of how we get to where we are. And this is basically the information we need to get us started, is this right here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this over to this. Well, I already did that. We're also going to zoom in a little bit here, just make it a little bigger. Maybe 125. There we go. And this is where we're at. And now the only thing we had to change was our crit chance, right? Because if we're building it third, we were assuming we're at 0.75. If we're building it second, we're at 0.5. So let's take a look at the numbers, right? What are we seeing? Before we saw that our breakpoint was around 200 armor. And now at half, it does look like LDR is quite a bit stronger across the board, right? It beats it out. It's not so much a breakpoint as it's we've already passed the breakpoint somewhere. So let's look at 150. We're about 2 off here, 4 off here, 2 off here. Okay. The reason, by the way, that I can only change this and we'll get a good idea is because I gave everybody a zeal item basically second. So the only thing that changes is the attack speed column, which I'm not changing. So these numbers are a bit inflated in that sense because your attack speed wouldn't be this high. You wouldn't have the zeal. But as we established in the original video, attack speed is basically just a multiplier on your damage. So yeah, basically this means if the attack speed changes, these numbers will change proportionally. So I didn't see a point in going too deep on that. We can just compare what it's like if you have half or 50% crit chance. So if we continue with our example of Xayah, we had 100 armor, or against a target with 100 armor. Our DPS with IE is 222 versus 209 at 50% crit. At 150 armor, that seems to be the new breakpoint. So rather than 200 armor, if you're getting it as a second item, LDR comes online sooner relative to that, relative to IE. But that's not the full picture of what we're interested in, right? We also want to know, what about Tabby? What about Randuin's? So I'll go ahead and copy in all of that information here from the original chart. And this is using, formulas. So this is taking into account the new 50% value we have here. So since the breakpoint was at 150 DPS for that, let's continue with that column and just see how it's looking. And it looks like if the target has Randuin's, LDR already is more efficient. It's the breakpoint, yes, but it leans a little bit towards LDR already. And it looks like the difference is quite a bit smaller also. Again, I'm using Xayah because I just used Xayah in the original video, but you can, of course, look at any of these. Like if we're comparing Caitlyn, we're looking at a difference of, here about close to 10-ish, and here closer to 15, right? So it does get smaller. And if we're talking with Tabby, they're much closer to each other. Here, the breakpoints, still roughly the same. Now, if they have Tabby and Randuin's at 150 armor, then it looks like, they're still really close to each other. This kind of makes sense, right? Because you're critting less. So LDR is going to be much closer in value to IE. But still interesting. I appreciate the question. And again, this isn't perfect. Of course, your AD would be a little bit lower probably because you're a lower level maybe when you're getting it as a second item as opposed to a third. But roughly, right? These numbers are roughly shedding some light on the breakpoints that you're looking for. But wait, right? A lot of you pointed out there's a cost component to this. There's a build path component, and we're going to talk about that. That's why I've got these values here. We're going to talk about that. But first, we're going to talk about the fact that LDR costs 350 less. So a lot of you pointed out, well, you should actually give all of the LDR columns 10 extra AD, and then talk about the numbers. Great point. Let's do that. Okay, so now what are we looking at? Before we saw the breakpoint was much closer to 150. Now, if you just bump up the AD by 10, so that additional longsword that you're getting here, you are seeing a much, much closer comparison. I mean, at 150 armor, which isn't that hard to get, right? Like, if we're talking about your average sort of bruiser champion, right? I was watching a bit of LCK recently, and I started to take notice. You know, I'm just randomly throughout the game, like what armor breakpoints are we looking at? And also in my own games, right? I'm looking at it, just curious, like, oh, what does the Xin Zhao's jungle have, right? At 12 minutes, level 9 or whatever. And 150 is not that hard to get for most champions, especially if you're building Tabby, right? Which is a pretty common thing to pick up, especially if they've got a heavy auto attacker on the enemy team. So 150 armor is a pretty realistic target for any champion in the game to be hitting at some point, which is why I like including it. Originally, I was going to have just 100 and 200, but I think 150 is just so much more realistic. But we see that LDR is eking out the win quite a bit. Again, this is just raw DPS, right? Let's take a look at Randuin's. I mean, if it's winning before Randuin's, it's gonna be winning after Randuin's as well. That just makes sense, because Randuin's is only going to reduce the crit damage, whereas LDR doesn't care about that. But Tabby brings them back closer together. Again, not by that much, but reasonably close. And if we're talking Tabby and Randuin's, I mean, LDR just wins, right? Like, if LDR is winning before we start stacking these effects that reduce auto attack damage, then yeah, I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer. So in terms of gold spent, LDR is going to give you a lot more value. And again, we have to talk about those caveats, right? Like, so many of you mentioned it in the comments down below as well, and I appreciate that. I mentioned it in the video as well. You're going to have abilities that do you damage, right? Let's talk about Xayah. Her feather pullback is so much of her overall damage, and it's going to be affected by LDR much more than IE. Yes, she has crit scaling in her feathers, I'm pretty sure, but not nearly as much to make up for the difference. So Xayah is one of those champions where you could reasonably argue that LDR might be a better buy than IE second or third, simply because of the way the champion scales and the way the champion works. This is true for other champions too, like Sivir, Lucian, right? These are like caster ADCs, where their abilities are really what's doing the damage, not the auto attacks. Jinx is a good example of a more auto attack heavy focused champion. But okay, there's another way to talk about cost, right? So let's revert these values back down to the original. And let's talk about damage per gold, right? Damage per gold spent. So in other words, the gold efficiency of the damage you're receiving. We're not going to do this for all of them. That would be kind of ridiculous, but we can start with something like, let's say C12. We're going to say this is going to be divided by 3450, and then we're going to say C13 divided by 3100. And what this shows us is basically the gold spent. Of course, this isn't taking account to the other gold you spent to get here, but you know, it's a rough calculation. And we can see that indeed, while like I used C12 and 13. So even though IE wins in overall DPS, we can see that in terms of gold spent, in terms of gold efficiency, you're getting more value from the LDR. But this is at 100 armor, right? So like, this is pretty interesting because LDR we think comes online later, but this 350 makes a huge difference, which we saw when we added that extra 10 AD as well, right? So these kind of go hand in hand. This is a good way to compare costs, right? You can either add the 10 AD or we can do something like this. So since 150 is sort of what we've decided is like a good realistic target that you may be hitting, let's talk about it here, right? Like this is where LDR, like Tabby plus Randuin's 150 armor. Let's compare these. Let's see what that looks like. So what is that? That's D54 divided by 3450, and then let's do D55 divided by 3100. And yeah, look at that. I mean, that's quite the difference. I mean, it's already kind of big here, but it only gets bigger. So it's an easy calculation to run, but like LDR simply is a lot more efficient when you're talking about this. And then build path is something somebody brought up as well, which I don't want to ignore. Or not just one of you, but lots of people brought up the build path, how it feels smoother, it's easier to get to, especially if you can't back with 1300 for that BF sword. So, you know, it's one of those things where, for me, this exercise shows that like LDR isn't as bad to get as a second or third item as it might seem. In fact, like I said, I was watching some LCK the other day, and I noticed there was a Caitlyn, I want to say, and Caitlyn went like collector LDR. And I think somebody in the comments said, like, if someone's building LDR second, I'm reporting them, you know? And it's like, well, maybe report whoever that was. I don't know. Was it Ruler? Maybe Ruler can do whatever he wants, though. So context matters, right? That's basically all I'm trying to say. But of course, you can always have something like too much armor pen, right? This is to address one of the commenters who said, like, Neela has built-in armor penetration. And that's true. Neela does have built-in armor penetration. And so they were saying that, like, LDR is better because you're going to stack the armor penetration, and bigger the number, the better. While that's true, of course, more armor penetration does indeed mean you're penetrating more armor. It doesn't always translate to more damage. If you're hitting a target with 100 armor, and you already have 30% pen natively, and then you add another 20%, right? Yes, you're penetrating more of the armor, but you would probably get way more value from the IE. I mean, especially on a champion like Neela, where like a lot of her damage does come from auto attacks, like, or her Q, which is an auto attack at the end of the day. So yes, more armor penetration, of course, is better in terms of penetrating more armor, but it's not better necessarily in terms of damage, especially if you already have armor penetration. Now let's talk about quickly the fact that on this list, and on the list of champions in general that I considered for this, Kindred wasn't one of them. I completely erased Kindred from my mind when I made this list. I didn't pay any attention, so indeed, this is Kindred erasure. Although, to be honest, most of the Kindreds I see go like Trinity Force or Kraken Slayer first, so by the way I explained which champions were on this list in the original video, it makes sense that Kindred wouldn't be included. But, commentary, you got me. I'm absolutely erasing Kindred from my databank here. Kindred's not a real champion. Now let's talk about Draven. Somebody asked Draven, or somebody told me rather, that Draven Q doesn't scale with crit, and so, you know, he gets some more value as he gets it at his second item, but he'll only be at 25% crit chance, which is fair. There's several champions that do this, so I think in the spirit of just exploration, let's change all of these values to 0.25 and see where that puts us, right? Like if you're the kind of champion who only builds crit later, or yeah, later in the game, you rush a first item. What does that look like? So you're getting IE second, but you don't actually have a lot of crit, or you're getting LDR second, you don't have a lot of crit because you built Blade of the Rune King first or Bloodthirster, right? So I excluded those champions because they do that, and I kind of wanted to explore the traditional crit landscape. But honestly, this isn't that hard to do, and I was, in retrospect, I guess I was just being lazy. But that doesn't matter. Can you tell this is unscripted? Let's take a look. We're looking at 182 to 180, 152 to 145 at 150 armor. So, again, this isn't surprising to see. Like, if you have a low crit chance, then building the crit amp item isn't going to give you a ton of value. So now it looks like the breakpoint is approaching 100 armor. Like, maybe it's 110, just looking at these numbers, taking a guess. But in terms of gold efficiency, we see that they are still pretty close to each other. I mean, LDR is going to be more gold efficient. It always will be, because of the way we're doing the math here. But if we're comparing like DPS at 150 armor, Tabby plus Randuin's, or maybe just 150 armor and Tabby, like people aren't building Randuin's that often. Maybe I should be not focusing on that so much. Let's compare this. This is a more realistic target. 138 to 132 on Xayah, 148 versus 154 on Caitlyn. Again, this is saying if you're building it as a second item, but your first item doesn't give you crit chance. So your Kraken Slayers, your Blade of the Rune Kings, your Trinity Force builders. LDR beats it in terms of DPS at that point because you're just critting less. And that's not surprising. But at 100, they're pretty even if they have Tabby. Like, if they have Tabby, they're astoundingly even, actually. So that's pretty interesting. I can't speak to too much how this affects Draven. I know his Q is like a huge damage amp based on how much AD you have. So the extra AD from IE probably makes it the better item in the end because you're just pumping out so much extra damage on that front. But I can't say for certain. It looks like LDR is a pretty strong contender though. Another person asked, what if you play Yone / Yasuo? Pretty vague, I'm not gonna lie. Don't really know what to do with that, but I thought about it for a little bit, so we can answer a few questions that this person may have had. Yone and Yasuo both, if you didn't know, double the amount of crit chance that they have. So if you build 20% crit, they have 40%. They just have to spend less. It doesn't make any sense. It's not fair. Whatever. We're moving on, right? But that means that if they're building... So they build Blade of the Ruined King first, right? Like both Yasuo and Yone tend to build that first. They come online with it. It's a game changer for them. And then they build a second item, you know, what have you. Shield bow, some of them go IE, whatever, right? Like, take your pick. Point is they all give 25%, but they would actually be sitting at 0.5, right? So this is, while this isn't showing Yasuo or Yone here, the numbers, if you're wondering about Yasuo and Yone, are going to be similar to these numbers because they would be at 50% crit with one additional item. Or if you build two items, they would be at 100% crit already. And we've already looked at having 25%, we've looked at half, we've looked at 75% in the original video. So just for fun, why not? Let's look at the numbers when you have 100% crit. And this is where, before I even look at the numbers, IE is going to beat out LDR, right? That just makes sense. If 100% of your auto attacks are critting, you're getting maximum value from that crit amp. It's going to be hard not to beat it. So we can see here, 150 armor. Yes, IE still beats it. 200 armor still beats it by like 10 DPS. 300 armor is where LDR beats it by like just a tiny little bit. So if we compare that to somebody with Tabby, not even close, not even close. 300 armor is the break point. That's where that's the great equalizer because at that point, yeah, LDR is doing its heavy. That's when you're getting maximum value from the armor penetration. But anywhere before that, like even with LDR, Tabby and Randuin's, it's just, yeah, you're just not going to get any better value than IE if you're talking about 100% crit. So makes perfect sense. It's the crit amp item in a crit build. You're going to be at this point. But again, if you're playing Yasuo and Yone, you only need 2 items to get here. So IE is really good on the guy who only needs 2 items to reach 100% crit chance. Who would have thought? But again, that's kind of a glass cannon situation, so this is why Yasuos are known for going 0-10. Somebody asked if there's a secret third item like Mortal Reminder or Blade of the Ruined King if you're playing against like Mundo, right? Like where they pointed out that the heal cut is probably more efficient than getting LDR or IE against that champion. And to that, I mean, again, I have to say context matters. Yes, of course, indeed. If you're playing against a Mundo, Mortal Reminder is a good item. That's pretty cut and dry. I don't think anybody's going to really argue with that. You need a heal cut against Mundo. Would you build Blade of the Ruined King on most ADCs that don't really want to build it, like a Jinx? No. Jinx is a scaling ADC that wants to go full crit so that she can pump out as much damage as possible against targets that are not Mundo. Because if everybody's focusing Mundo because his entire team is dead, he's probably still going to die, no matter how much healing he has. You should consider Mortal Reminder, though, in that case still. Because, I mean, yeah, maybe somebody else is building the heal cut, but still. Point is, situations matter, right? The enemy team matters. And that was the central point, right, of my original video, is that the choices you make when it comes to what to build absolutely should be dependent on the enemy team. And that includes IE versus LDR versus Mortal Reminder. Not versus Blade of the Ruined King, though. I mean, that's sort of a lobby situation, right? If you see a Mundo, you know Blade of the Ruined King is going to go hard, so yeah, maybe lock in Twitch, right, and build Blade of the Ruined King first for late game. But that's a whole different topic. That's drafting, right? Team comps. So to answer your question, there's no secret third item that's better or anything like that, but there are situationally against one particular champion on the enemy team sometimes better options. And finally, somebody asked for a very specific comparison, which was Xayah, 3 autos, 1 Q, 1 E. So I went ahead and delivered. Here we go. This is Xayah, 3 autos, 1 Q, 1 E. In terms of DPS, IE was given 283, LDR was given 316 at 200 armor. Since 200 armor was our breakpoint for third item, again, this is third item, I decided to test it at 200 armor. Of course, you can test it at others. It took me all of 5 minutes to hop into the practice tool, so you didn't specify what armor value, but I decided to pick 200. And this makes sense, of course, again, because Xayah is a sort of caster ADC, right? A lot of her damage is in those feathers, so it makes sense that if you're doing the pullback, right, you're casting Q, you're auto-attacking, you're going to get more value out of the pullback on the feathers, out of the damage, out of the amp that LDR gives you because you're doing physical damage. So I hope that answers that question. And the last thing I want to address is simply that somebody asked about magic pen versus blood letters, like flat pen or percent pen versus blood letters, when that math lesson's coming, and frankly the answer to that is soon. I do have a video in the works about magic penetration and specifically blood letters because that's a new addition and it's kind of wonky because it's the black cleaver, right? Like it's a good item, but it's harder to feel its value because you're amping your team's damage as well. But that's for a whole different video. Magic pen is not what we're talking about in this video. I appreciate the question though, and thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this was informative. I hope this answered your primary concerns. Thank you so much for leaving the comments. Thank you so much for engaging with the content. I had a lot of fun doing this. I hope to do another follow-up if there's more questions that need to be answered, but I'll be hanging out in the comments where we can answer some more of these questions and talk about it more if you guys want to. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching this entry, or this rather appendix entry in the League Encyclopedia.